Try to picture the future. Not your personal future, but the future, the collective one, the place that history is headed. Now watch what your imagination actually serves up. Option 1 is catastrophe. Climate collapse, pandemic, war, the standing repertoire we all know of possible endings. Option 2 is gadgets. The present, but with better phones, thinner screens, smarter assistants. It's the same world, but upgraded. Option 3 is reruns, nostalgia, reboots, franchises, the endless restoration of cultural property from decades ago. Missing from this menu is the thing that nearly every previous modern generation kept in stock, which was a picture of a genuinely different way of organizing life. Different economics, different institutions, a different answer to the question of how might people live together. The 20th century overflowed with such pictures. Many of them were naive, some of them were monstrous, but all of them were evidence that the future was understood to be open. But somewhere in the last few decades, that openness quietly closed. The future, at least as understood and conceived and imagined, stopped being a place where things could be otherwise and instead became a place where the present merely continues but with updates until it crashes. A British theorist gave this closure a name, and his account has become one of the most influential pieces of cultural diagnosis of the century so far. I'm Andrew Chapman. I'm a professor of philosophy, and I'll be your guide. The theorist is Mark Fisher. He was a British writer, teacher, and blogger. In fact, his blog, K-Punk, was required reading in the 2000s theory internet, and in 2009 he published a short book called Capitalist Realism, Is There No Alternative? The subtitle quotes Margaret Thatcher's famous slogan about capitalism, and the book is an autopsy of what happened to political imagination after Thatcher's slogan won. Fisher wrote in plain, furious, readable prose about ordinary institutional life, things like call centers, university bureaucracy, mental health services, and he died in 2017 by his own hand, which gives his work on depression and cultural stagnation a posthumous weight that has only grown. The book's central concept is capitalist realism, and the name needs care because it's slightly misleading. Capitalist realism is a claim about capitalism's inevitability rather than about its goodness or its actual existing features. It names the widespread and mostly unspoken and usually unrecognized sense that capitalism is the only viable way to organize a society, that whatever its failures, nothing else is realistic. You may have seen this in discussions with people if you talk about things like fascism or socialism or communism or feudalism. They can only conceive of these things in terms of modifications to capitalism. So socialism becomes capitalism but with lots of taxation. Fascism becomes capitalism but with a dictatorship. Fisher's book opens with a line that he borrowed and made famous. It has become easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. Capitalist realism is the condition that sentence describes, a horizon of thought inside which alternatives don't get refuted because they never quite manage to appear as serious possibilities in the first place. This capitalist realist condition has a date of birth, and naming that date explains why the future closed when it did, rather than at some other time. For most of the 20th century, capitalism had a visible rival. Whatever one thought of communism, whether it actually existed, whether what we were seeing actually was communism, and of course there were many things to think about the states that called themselves communist, the Soviet bloc stood as proof of concept that a society could be organized on entirely different principles than capitalist ones. That rival system anchored the political imagination of an entire era. Alternatives felt real because an actual alternative was sitting there on the map. Then, between 1989 and 1991, the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union dissolved. Not to say that these happened on their own or because of failures internal to the states themselves. There's much history, much theory to be done on this, but simply that these things happened. The most prominent large-scale alternative to capitalism at this point collapsed, and in many places it appeared discredited. The air went out of the idea that history was still choosing between systems. Francis Fukuyama famously announced the end of history, meaning the end of the contest over how to organize society, and Fukuyama saw liberal capitalism as the last contestant standing. Fisher's capitalist realism is the long cultural mood that settled in after the supposed end of history. It's not the triumphant version of this mood, but the exhausted one, where capitalism wins by default, not because anyone admires it, but because the alternatives have all left the building. Thatcher's "there is no alternative" started as a political slogan, but after 1991 it hardened into something that felt like a description of reality itself. The crucial feature of capitalist realism is that it operates as an atmosphere rather than a doctrine. Nobody has to argue you into capitalist realism. There aren't any required readings, no party meetings, no loyalty oaths to the capitalist market. Capitalist realism just installs itself as common sense, the background assumption that pre-sorts ideas into the realistic and the unrealistic before any debate even begins. Propose adjusting a tax rate and you're doing politics, but propose a different economic order entirely and you're just doing fantasy, and that verdict arrives instantly, pre-reflectively, with a slightly embarrassed smile rather than at the end of an argument. That instant verdict is capitalist realism functioning. Its deepest victory was relocating the system from the category of things that humans built and made and could make alternatives to the category of reality, alongside gravity and weather, things that serious adults just adapt to rather than dispute. Perhaps Fisher's sharpest observation concerns belief itself. Capitalist realism doesn't require anyone to think capitalism is good, to believe that it's functioning well. Almost no one thinks this about capitalism. Cynicism about the system is nearly universal, even amongst proponents of capitalism. They'll say that what we have now isn't pure capitalism, or isn't capitalism functioning as capitalism should. No one is a cheerleader of what we've got going on right now. You're allowed to mock the corporation, to hate your job, to post bitterly about the housing market, and then act and plan and vote exactly as if nothing else were possible. The system runs on this combination of inner distance and outer compliance, subjective disbelief, objective obedience. The cynicism even helps because it feels like resistance while quietly substituting for it. If you've ever heard the phrase the commodification of dissent, this is one version of it. The book's most discussed argument concerns mental health, and it shows the concept cutting into ordinary institutional life. The argument also needs to be stated very carefully because it's easy to misread in a way that Fisher obviously didn't intend. Fisher noted the explosion of diagnoses, whether professional or self-diagnoses, of depression and anxiety, especially among the young, and the way that depression and anxiety get framed as private misfortune to be treated one brain at a time. He calls this the privatization of stress. His argument wasn't that depression is purely social, or that brain chemistry is irrelevant, or that medication and therapy don't help real people. That misreading would be both false and dangerous to anyone who took it as advice. Depression is genuinely partially biological, genuinely individual, and genuinely treatable at the level of the single person. Fisher's point sits alongside all of this, not against it. What the purely individual framing of depression and anxiety can't explain is the epidemiology. Why these numbers in these populations at this moment? If vast numbers of people living under precarious work, unpayable debt, permanent assessment, and the mandate to be their own entrepreneur are breaking down, then the distribution of the breakdown is information about the conditions, even when each individual case has its own biological and personal reality. Treating the pattern as nothing but millions of unrelated private malfunctions is itself a kind of achievement. It's capitalist realism's most intimate operation, in which every structural casualty files their suffering under personal inadequacy, and the conditions go unnamed. The same operation runs through the institutions that Fisher knew firsthand. Education reframed as investment in one's own human capital. The university converted into a metrics factory, audits and rankings and performance indicators, a regime that Fisher called market Stalinism, where documenting performance matters more than performing does. Everywhere, the same signature: systemic conditions experienced as individual tests and failed and grieved alone. Then there's culture, where Fisher's diagnosis becomes genuinely haunting, and where it also draws its strongest objection, which the analysis has to face. In his later writing, especially his Ghosts of My Life, Fisher developed an idea adapted from the Italian theorist Franco Berardi: the slow cancellation of the future. Play someone in 1970 a record from 1990, and the 20-year gap would land as a shock. New sounds, new forms, things that couldn't have existed earlier. Play someone in 2006 a record from today, and the gap shrinks toward nothing. The formal momentum of popular culture, its capacity to produce the structurally new, decelerated even as the sheer volume of production exploded. What fills the space is the past. Revivals, reissues, reboots, franchises, aesthetics named after decades, the whole back catalog permanently in rotation. The serious objection to that claim is this: plenty of people will immediately think of counterexamples, entire native internet aesthetics, new musical microgenres appearing and mutating monthly, meme forms, the strange new vernaculars of short video. Novelty, the critics argue, didn't disappear. It changed scale and location. Instead of arriving as shared, era-defining mass culture that everyone encounters at once, it now emerges in fragmented online subcultures, moving fast but rarely cohering into a dominant style that marks a decade. That's a real challenge for Fisher, and the honest response is that it modifies his thesis rather than demolishing it. Something genuinely shifted in culture's relationship to time, we might say. That's the loss of a shared future, the broadly legible sense that culture as a whole is going somewhere, even if invention never actually stopped in the corners. What survives is Fisher's link between the cultural condition and the economic one. The broadly new requires conditions the current arrangement removes: unmetered time, security, spaces not yet optimized for return. A culture of precarious freelancers can rarely afford the long experiment. Risk capital flows to proven properties. The reboot is the rational art form of a society that no longer believes in a shared future, and the nostalgia saturating everything is the emotional registration of that lost belief. Given this apparently totalizing picture, one might forgive Fisher for despairing, but he doesn't. Capitalist realism presents itself as realism, as the mature, disillusioned acceptance of how things simply are. Its entire power rests on a claim about reality that's false. Capitalism is an arrangement built by people with a start date and, as 1989 demonstrated in the other direction, with the capacity to change shape faster than anyone expects. The, quote, realism is an ideological achievement wearing the costume of fact, and that makes it vulnerable in a specific way. An atmosphere persists only while it stays invisible. Name it, and it becomes an object rather than an atmosphere, something with edges, a history, and therefore an outside. This is why Fisher insisted that the first political act is the destruction of the appearance of natural order. Every time a, quote, fact of life gets redescribed as a decision, every time exhaustion, debt, precarity, or stagnation gets traced to an arrangement rather than absorbed as fate, a small piece of the horizon reopens. The person who stops asking, what's wrong with me, and starts asking, what are these conditions doing to people like me, has, in Fisher's terms, already begun. The future didn't evaporate. It's being held in a particular place, inside the belief that the present is inevitable. Anything that cracks that belief is a door. So the empty menu from our opening, catastrophe, gadgets, reruns, has an explanation. Not that those are the only options, but that our imagination has been conditioned by something. The future didn't die of natural causes because it didn't die at all. It got captured and enclosed by a horizon of assumed inevitability that settled in after capitalism's great rival collapsed. That enclosure works precisely as long as it goes unnoticed, processing every alternative as fantasy and every casualty as a private failure. Fisher's book stays short, angry, and strangely energizing because its conclusion inverts its premise. A condition that depends entirely on seeming natural is a condition that naming damages. It's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. And that sentence, once heard clearly, makes the difficulty itself visible, dateable, and therefore open to question. The inability to imagine alternatives is real. It's also manufactured, and recent, and historically specific. And manufactured things can be unmade, but only if we name and understand them first.